I would like to remind the audience to show courtesy to both our speakers. In particular, this means that no shoes can be thrown at them. However, as Hamza does boxing training, I'm confident he could show George W. Bush a thing or two when it comes to dodging any oncoming projectiles.
Hamza is such a fine speaker. You might enjoy listening to Hamza for an eternity. I think Hamza would enjoy listening to Hamza for an eternity. I'm just getting my own back for the little quip about my being easy, but then I live in Soho, so I am easy.
Well, that's cheap. It's probably as cheap as the wine that you've been referring to all day. I mean, okay, that's okay. Well, thank you. You're arguing my point. Let me just argue for you too.
I do think you have to do with it.
Yeah, but let me make.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Good evening, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. I feel privileged for being asked to chair this event at my former university, where I graduated some 15 years ago. I'm also delighted that the Islamic Society is reviving the long-held Islamic tradition of intellectual debate, where profound and far-reaching philosophical issues are discussed with believers and non-believers alike, with people who believe in God and those who don't believe in God. We're reminded of Abu Hanifa, Imam Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah, to name but a few, whose contribution to human thought is unprecedented, and their ideas live on in voluminous works. Tonight's debate is entitled, "Can we live better lives without religion?" And I'm sure you'll all agree that that is a very important question. Well, of course you do, otherwise you wouldn't be here, and there's no free food, so that must be the reason why you are here. Now, tonight's debate is actually not an abstract philosophical discussion. It's about life. It's about what we say about it, what we should do with it, and most importantly, how we can make it better. So this subject affects all of us. In recent times, we have been witnessing a campaign that is seeking to highlight the apparent incompatibility between reason and religion. This campaign is focused on attributing total irrationality and ignorance to religion. This campaign, sometimes known as neo-atheism, has its high priests, see what I did there, such as Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. And they've had some considerable success insofar as developing a new narrative against the revival and existence of current religious worldviews. So tonight we will examine and scrutinize the validity of a particular aspect of this very narrative. So I will now introduce our participants. So we have Peter Cave on our extreme right. He is a philosopher lecturer and the British Humanist Association's chair of the Humanist Philosophers Group. He gives talks, lectures, debates, and publishes papers on a wide range of philosophical topics, often with a humorous twist. He is the author of Humanism, A Beginner's Guide, and of the best-selling Can a Robot Be a Human? And What's Wrong with Eating People? So I hope you don't mind, Peter, if I don't accept an invitation to your house for dinner. So,
It depends on the quality of wine.
So his website is found at www.petercave.com. Hamza Tzortzis, to his left, is a senior researcher and lecturer for I-ERA. He is a convert to Islam from humanism. He has participated in debates both at home and abroad with leading academics and intellectuals on the philosophy of religion, politics, and society. He delivers lectures across the world to articulate and has also shed much-needed light on Islam and its way of life. He runs the blog, which is www.hamzatzortzis.blogspot.com, and I'm not going to bother spelling that out, so you can see that later. Oh, and by the way, he's Greek, which is always nice. Now, before I ask Hamza to begin his opening presentation, I would like to set some ground rules and give you the format of tonight. So each speaker will speak for 25 to 30 minutes maximum. And after each opening presentation, I will ask each speaker to respond with a 7-minute rebuttal. Finally, we will have a question and answer session, with each speaker asking each other a few questions first, and then you, the audience, will be able to address our participants. I would like to remind the audience to show courtesy to both our speakers. In particular, this means that no shoes can be thrown at them. However, as Hamza does boxing training, I'm confident he could show George W. Bush a thing or two when it comes to dodging any oncoming projectiles. I would also request that all mobile phones are switched off or they are put on silent mode. And without further ado, I invite Hamza to the platform.
I'm going to start, as Muslims do, with the name of God. Innal hamdulillah, wassalatu, wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. I greet you all with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. One of the prophets of neo-atheism, Christopher Hitchens, in his bestseller, God is Not Great, wrote the following words. He said, "As I write these words, and as you read them, people of faith are in the different ways planning your and my destruction, and the destruction of all the hard-won human attainments that I have touched upon. Religion poisons everything." Is he right? Or is he a byproduct of our secular society, conditioned to point the finger at religion? And this is what today's debate is about. Before I get into my main arguments, I would like to start with some definitions. Now, upon surveying the various definitions for religion, looking at literature and philosophical dictionaries, I have personally come to the conclusion that the definition for mainstream religion is the belief in a God, and that God commands you to do things. Peter Cave, sorry, that wasn't a Freudian slip at all. Peter Cave, rather. How unfortunate. Peter Cave. I'm running out of time. Peter Cave, in his book Humanism, he writes about religion and conforms to my description. He says, it involves the belief in God or gods, where the belief generates doctrines of morality and how life should be lived. Hence, from now on, I'm going to be using the word religion and Islam interchangeably. Now, my argument is that religion does make your life better. And the way I'm going to show this is by saying that the things in religion that are beneficial to your life are actually unique to religion and can never be replaced by non-religious or irreligious life. I'll give you an example. Say you have two bottles. One is full of water, the other one is also full of water, but it has some special herbs in it that are beneficial for your health, for example. They both quench your thirst. But the best bottle is the one with the herbs, because it has additional benefits that's unique to that bottle. I will argue religion, and specifically Islam, is exactly that. To support this, I will use four main arguments. 1, sociological. 2, philosophical. 3, moral. And 4, political. However, before I get into the thick of the argument, I like to highlight that all the negative things, all the evils attributed to religion are actually not unique to religion. I repeat, all the negative and evil things attributed to religion are not unique to religion. In this light, the former professor of divinity at Oxford University, Keith Ward, he writes, "It is very difficult to think of any organized human activity that could not be corrupted. The lesson is that anti-religious corruptions and religious corruptions are both possible. There is no magic system or belief, not even in the belief in liberal democracy, which can be guaranteed to prevent it." And let me give an example. Let's talk about the outdated cliche of religion causes war and conflict. Well, is that unique to religion? I argue that the common conceptual denominator is humanity itself. Let me give you some examples. 70 million people died under Chairman Mao. 20 million people died under Stalin. 700,000 innocent Iraqis no longer exist because of the contemporary war. What about World War I and World War II, the Vietnam War, the mass murder of newborn baby girls in China, or Hiroshima, Nagasaki? What about the ethnic cleansing of Tibetans? So my point is, these conflicts and this violence and war wasn't done under the name of religion, but under the name of secular, non-religious ideology. So, in the question and answers, I ask you all to have more of a nuanced approach to this discussion and transcend the outdated cliches. Let me go into my arguments. My first argument is a sociological argument, and it can be summarized as follows. Religion makes your life better in contrast to a lack of religion because it has been shown to facilitate better mental health, better physical health, lower levels of crime, higher levels of happiness, and higher levels of altruism and philanthropic activity. Let me give you some examples from key academic works in the study of sociology. Example number 1. In the Handbook of Religion and Health, edited by Harold Koenig, Michael McCullough, and David Larson, they reviewed 2,000 published experiments designed to test the relationship between religion and various medical conditions. The overall results were that people of religion live longer, they have physically healthier lives, young people have lower levels, significantly lower levels of drug and alcohol abuse, lower levels of criminal delinquency, and attempted suicide. A positive correlation. Example number 2. The Gallup survey on religion in America concluded that people who agree that God is very important to their lives are twice as likely to report being very happy, in contrast to those who said God is not important to their lives. And the National Opinion Research Center reported exactly the same conclusions. Example number 3. In 2000, political scientist and Professor Robert Putnam surveyed 200 volunteer organizations, and it showed a positive correlation between religiosity and membership of those charitable organizations. Similarly, the Index of Philanthropy, Global Philanthropy, in 2007, it states, religious people are more charitable than non-religious, not only in giving to their own congregations, but also, regardless of income, region, social class, and other demographic variables, and significantly more charitable in their secular donations and informal giving. Now, Peter Cave also writes in his book, Humanism, what, though, is the conceptual or logical link between morality and the belief in God? Humanists claim there is none. Well, in light of the above, I would later on kindly ask him to reconsider his assumptions. Argument number 2. It's a philosophical argument. Religion makes your life better than a lack of religion because of the logic of submission. Listen to this carefully. 1. God is all-knowing and all-wise. 2. Human beings are obviously not. 3. Therefore, it is rational and beneficial to follow what God has said. But on scratching the intellectual surface, there's some hidden premises here. And what are the hidden premises? Well, the hidden premises are that God exists and that He has revealed something to humanity. I believe this can be substantiated by showing that the uniqueness of the Quran can only be best explained supernaturally. And in doing so, I will prove the existence of a supernatural cognitive power, i.e. God, and at the same time, showing that the Quran is what He revealed. In other words, explaining that the Quran is a miracle. Firstly, though, what are miracles? According to the older philosophers, such as David Hume and others, they said miracles are violations of natural law. But does this make sense? Surely this is an ironclad description of what miracles are. Because what are the reality of natural laws? Well, natural laws are just inductive generalizations of patterns we perceive in the universe. Now, if something breaks that pattern, does it mean it's a miracle? No, I think that's incoherent. I would argue, well, maybe it was part of the pattern. So we have to miraculously rediscover a coherent meaning for the word miracle. And I would argue that the best description for a miracle are acts of impossibilities. So we have to search for supernatural explanation. In the words of the philosopher William Lane Craig, he says, miracles are events that lie outside the productive capacity of nature. So in this way, we have to look for non-natural explanations. Now, with regards to the Quran is a unique piece of literature. Its literary form, the structural features of the Arabic language in the Quran, de-scope the Arabic language. It lies outside any expression of the Arabic language. For example, the famous Arabist A.J. Arbery, he says, "For the Quran is neither prose nor poetry, but a unique fusion of both." Similarly, the professor and Arabist Hamilton Gibb, he says, as a result of humanity not being able to challenge or emulate this unique literary form and structure, concludes the following. He says, the Meccans, the people at the time of revelation 1400 years ago, still demanded of him a miracle. And with remarkable boldness and self-confidence, Muhammad appealed as a supreme confirmation of his mission to the Quran itself. Like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well then, if the Quran were his own composition, other men could rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it. If they could not, and it is obvious that they could not, let them accept the Quran as an outstanding evidential miracle. So since all the finite letters and the finite words and the finite grammatical rules in the Arabic language have been exhausted, and we cannot produce the form of the Quran, the literary form and structure of the Quran, then surely we need to be looking for supernatural explanations. So let's go back to our definition. Since the Quran cannot be emulated, and since we have exhausted all possibilities of the nature of the Quran, which is the Arabic language, then it must be a miracle. Let me give you the summary. 1. A miracle is an event which lies outside the productive capacity of nature. 2. The Quran's unique literary form lies outside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language. 3. Therefore the Quran is a miracle, which proves the existence of a supernatural cognitive power, in other words, God, but also shows that the Quran is His word. So we've justified the logic of submission. 1. God is all-knowing, all-wise. 2. Human beings are not. 3. Therefore it is rational and beneficial to follow what God has said. My third argument is a moral argument, and it can be summarized as follows. Religion makes your life better because it is the only basis for objective morality. Morality that has meaning. The word better in our discussion today is a moral or value judgment. Something is better, something is worse, something is bad, something is good. Now I would argue that without God, we cannot meaningfully discuss today's topic. Peter should go home. This is because the logic of submission. This is because without God, there is no objective value and objective morality. Now this doesn't mean humanists or atheists or people of no religion do not display moral behavior. Of course they do. Peter's a great guy. As he says in his book, the overall... well, he did say you were easy. The overall humanist stance is that moral behavior needs neither belief in a God nor the motivation to please in a God. I agree. But the argument is not about behavior. It's about moral ontology, the basis of morality. Can we say the Holocaust was objectively morally wrong, 100% wrong, regardless if the Nazis had occupied the whole world and brainwashed us? It's still objectively wrong. But you can't say this without the existence of God. Because I said, God is the only objective anchor that transcends human subjectivity. In this light, the famous Mackie, rather his name was J.L. Mackie, a professor of Oxford University, one of the most influential atheists of our time, he says, if there are objective values, they make the existence of God more probable than would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of God. So, can we say killing a young child is morally wrong? 100% morally wrong. Who believes in this? Put your hand up. To kill a child is 100% morally wrong. Objective. Well, you can only say this if you have a religious or godly worldview. Because as I said, God is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. In the absence of God, there's only two other possible foundations. And those come from evolution and social pressure. But can evolution provide an objective basis for morality? What does evolution say? That we're just accidental byproducts of a very long, lengthy evolutionary process. Our morality has evolved like our ears or our teeth or our toenails. And it's illusory, because biology says that we're going to change. And if your morality is pegged on your biology, then your morals are going to change. So it's not objective anymore. This is why Michael Ruse, the philosopher of science, points this out. He explains, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands, feet and teeth. Considered as a rational, justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. So can social pressure provide an objective basis for morality? The quick answer is no. Any superficial reading on the study of social psychology, sociology, social constructionism, anyone who would read a book from Vivian Burr called The Introduction to Social Constructionism would quickly conclude that the influential structures of a particular society moves the values and morals to certain goals. That's why we have the term modernity, which basically means, from a layman perspective, don't really believe in anything because your values are going to change over time. So we can summarize the argument as follows. 1. God is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. 2. The religious worldview is the belief in a God. 3. Therefore, religious perspectives on morality and values are objective, and non-religious perspectives are illusory. Now, to close this section, I believe Peter Cave does believe that killing 6 million Jews is objectively morally wrong. But he can only believe that if God exists and that you carry a religious perspective. As Richard Taylor, one of the most famous ethicists, he writes, the modern age, more or less, repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and moral wrong, without noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the meaningfulness of right and wrong as well. Argument number 4, and my final argument, is a political argument. Islam makes your life better than a lack of religion because its economic model deals with poverty and creates financial stability better than any other model, past or present. Let's look at the situation about global poverty. It is one of abject poverty and misery. 3 billion in the world live on fewer than $2 a day. 1.3 billion have no access to clean water. 3 billion have no access to sanitation, and 2 billion have no access to electricity. what does Islam have to say? I'm going to deliver the 6 major features of the Islamic economic model. The first feature, individual needs are defined. Islam carries a truthful, honest perspective on geopolitics. Individual needs are defined, and there's enough resources to deal with these individual needs. In a statement from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said, the son of Adam, in other words humanity, has no better right than he would have a house, a piece of cloth, and a piece of bread. Food, shelter, and clothing. And what this creates is a macroeconomy of dealing with the number one economic problem of distribution, rather than the liberal, non-religious economic perspective of competition. Hence, the reason we could buy the nice cameras and look very nice as you all do today is because there has to be poor. Competition, what does it mean? Someone's going to lose out, your fellow brother. And this is why the geopolitical myth of liberal economics is damaging. There's too many needs and not enough resources. Point number 2. Islam removes interest. The Quranic injunction says, God has permitted trade and forbidden interest. Because interest restricts the distribution of wealth. And when you remove interest, there's more there's more money in the hands of society and individuals. And this leads nicely to my third point, which is about Islamic taxation aiding the distribution of wealth. Because income tax is only 2.5%. Rather, there is no income tax, but rather there is a tax that's only 2.5%. And this creates an economic stimulus. Because someone may argue, if you take interest out, people have too much money, you don't tax people, there's too much money, therefore keep it at home and hoard it. But under Islamic economic model, it decreases 2.5% every year. So that's an economic stimulus to take your money and inject it back into society, to promote entrepreneurship and elevate the economic standards of your particular society. And this is in stark contrast to the US. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, it concluded that the combined federal, state, and local government average tax rate for most workers is 40%. And this does not even include indirect taxation. Even from a utilitarian perspective, we should want an Islamic economic model. We'll have more money. Point number 4, it prevents monopolies. Everyone heard about the credit crunch? Well, you're students, you probably get money from your parents, right? So, the credit crunch happened because you just let freedom be too free, if that ever makes sense. The global market of free economy, with no mechanisms to prevent hoarding of wealth, monopolies, and all the issues that were deliberately, in some cases by some bankers, done to create this financial crisis. But Islam doesn't say that. It says there must be mechanisms in the free market economy in order to balance things out. And that's why the Quranic injunction that says, wealth does not become a commodity between the rich among you, is a basis to deal with the free market economic boom and bust cycles. Point number 5. Natural resources are actually people's wealth. More money in the hands of society again. Because of a statement from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said people are partners in 3 things: water, pastures, and fire. The intellectual heritage of Islam, the classical scholarship, derived that this has to do with the natural resources. And I would argue that if Saudi Arabia really followed their prophet, my prophet, then it's estimated that from the oil revenues, people will be getting $20,000 a year without working. Last point, point number 6, is about stability. Issuing money is actually a duty of the state, and it must be pegged on something substantial like the gold or silver. In Islamic economics, the government is only allowed to print money, which is in stark contrast to liberal economics, especially in Britain, where the banks can print and destroy their money. And in this light, Reginald McKenna, one of the British Chancellors of the Exchequer at one time, he said, "I am afraid that the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks or the Bank of England can create and destroy money." And I agree. So in Islam, gold is the standard for currency. So money is not free floating. So that means it's pegged on something substantial, like wealth, like gold. So when there's more money in society, it actually means there's more wealth. So businesses, their wealth is not devalued because of the printing of money. And this has historical precedents when, at a point in time in Islamic history, governments decided to use these principles. During the Ottoman period in 1507, 58 silver aspers could buy 1 gold coin. After 82 years in 1589, 1 gold coin cost 62 aspers. That's only 7% inflation in 82 years. You get that in 6 months in some European countries. And I think the letter that was written in 1453 by a rabbi living in the Ottoman period sums the Islamic economic model very well. And he says, "Here in the land of the Turks," in other words, the Muslims, "we have nothing to complain of. We possess great fortunes, much gold and silver in our hands. We are not oppressed by heavy taxes, and our commerce is free and unhindered. Rich are the fruits of the earth. Everything is cheap, and every one of us lives in peace and freedom." Now to conclude, the question today was, can we live better lives without religion? I believe, I have shown, that the negative things attributed to religion are not unique to religion itself, but the common conceptual denominator is humanity. And I used crisis and conflict and war as an example. I also think I showed that the positive and beneficial things in Islam and religion are unique to religion, specifically, and cannot be replaced by a non-religious or secular or atheist worldview. So it logically follows that we can't live better lives without religion, because religion, specifically Islam, have benefits that cannot be replaced by non-religious life. So to end, I would like to highlight that for humanists or people of no religion, their main philosophical premise in trying to intellectually defeat religion is, in the words of Peter Cave's colleague and my previous debater, the famous philosopher Dr. Nigel Warburton, when he said, "Tell me of something human that was taken by religion and made better." Well, according to tonight's evidence, it would not be surprising if you were to conclude that religion, specifically Islam, took life and made it better. This is why in the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, it says, "O you who believe, respond to the call of God and His Messenger to that which gives you life." The implications here, if you don't respond, then maybe we're just dead people. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Hamza. I would like to now invite Peter Cave to take the podium.
Well, I must admit, I don't know where to begin, except that's a way of beginning, of course. I suppose at these events, particularly at this event, with such a fine, dare I say, silver-tongued speaker, I'm worried that I might suddenly be converted to the Quran. But then, all of a sudden, I think this is unlikely to happen, because I think you started losing me, and certainly lost some of the audience, when all of a sudden you were managing to deduce economic models from the Quran, and that seems rather implausible, particularly if we bear in mind the state of certain Islamic countries. There are so many things which you said. Again, I start pondering on where to begin. You talk about how many, many people are in abject poverty and misery. Indeed, that's true. That's terribly true. At this very moment, millions of people are starving and suffering. It's amazing to me that you can accept that and yet also talk about there being an all-powerful God, who I believe for many religions is meant to be a loving God. That sits uneasily to me as a humanist, and so that's a sort of consideration which would lead me to start wondering quite what's going on here, Hamza. I'm quickly glancing down the list of other points you made. Somehow we had a story about 2 bottles of water one with herbs in. I hope the one with herbs in meant grapes and it was a nice bottle of red wine. At another point, you seem to be quoting, I suspect, incredibly dubious statistics about how religious people are happier than other people. Well, okay, if you want to be a hedonist and just go for happiness, that's fine. Some of us have greater values like truth and compassion and respect. Sorry, that's a rather cheap comment, but often humanists are accused of just being concerned about happiness. Strangely, that's what seemed to come out of your talk, Hamza. But overall, as I said earlier on, and you've mocked me a little bit, I'm easygoing. I'm a humanist, I'm an atheist, and I want to live and let live. So I have no objection at all to many, many people being religious, be they Christians or Muslims or Hindus or worshipping Nordic gods or the Olympic gods. That's fine. That adds to the variety of life. And unlike some of my colleagues, I actually value religions being around. I enjoy going to evensong in churches sometimes because I enjoy the music. But what I don't enjoy and what makes me think religion is not beneficial to society overall is because many, many religious people, though not all religious people, try to impose their beliefs on others. That's the key thing which I'd keep coming back to, and why I talked about my being easy, is that humanists and atheists do not try to impose atheism and humanism on others. They'll discuss it, they'll talk about it, but we are live and let live so long as we're not harming each other. Whereas, as all of us know, certainly in the heart of our hearts, many religious people, not all, note, but many religious people do try to impose their beliefs on others. In Britain, for example, the bishops will try to prevent the existence of voluntary euthanasia, of assisted dying, because of their religious beliefs. Catholics in some parts of the world will impose the claim that you ought not to use contraceptives. Seems very bizarre to me. In the Holy Bible, in the New Testament, Jesus Christ had it in for lust. Some of us at my age enjoy lust. That's the best it gets. So I could go through a whole range of little items. I believe in the Quran, I believe certain interpretations of the Quran and certainly certain interpretations of the Bible lead many religious people to say that homosexuality is wicked and there should be laws against it. And a very important philosopher stroke scientist stroke mathematician, Alan Turing, who was at Cambridge in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, because he was so oppressed by the fact he was a homosexual, he ended up committing suicide eating a poison apple. Which maybe you might say that goes back to Adam and Eve, but beware the apple, so to speak. But nonetheless, there have been many, many tragic outcomes as a result of various religious beliefs. It's fair comment, though, for Hamza to say, yes, there's many tragic outcomes as a result of atheists. I don't deny that. And so if we start thinking about this, one question is to do with the empirical question, which Hamza was using a fair bit, namely, how many deaths or harms have come about as a result of religions as opposed to as a result of atheism or humanism. I honestly think you can't work that out. I think that's a bizarre way of looking at things. For a start, who knows which religions we're talking about, whether they're being followed correctly. Of course, many religious believers would think society would be much better if there was no lusting in the heart, or if there was no homosexuality, whereas humanists would think that's fine. Overall, then, we're not going to be able to measure the harms or the non-harms in that way. So the empirical question doesn't really get me going, because I don't think there is any clear way of establishing whether belief in religion is more likely to generate a flourishing society or not. Where my concern is with regard to far more important issues, which I think, dare I say, Hamza, religion is found wanting. The debate, of course, is meant to be about religion, though I notice that Hamza, I strangely get the impression that he thinks the only true religion is Islam. I'm not sure if it's meant to be the Sunni version or the Sharia version or many other versions, no doubt, which is always a problem for any religious believer. Namely, you have different makes. In Christianity, as you know, we have Catholics, we have Church of England, we have Lutherans, we have Quakers. There's a whole range, and they disagree at times. What's also fascinating with regard to any particular religion and any particular make of any particular religion and any particular model of that make, it sounds like a Volvo car, sort of different models of different makes. but home in, focus on one particular model or one particular make, and you'll realize that there's many disagreements. The obvious disagreements tend to concern sex, which is always of interest to some of us, but they tend to concern sex with regard to homosexuality, contraception, premarital sex, and so on. And as I said, as a humanist, I really don't mind if groups of people actually do not want to engage in homosexual activities or do not want to engage in premarital sex. My concern is when they start oppressing other people with regard to their lives. That's the main concern which I have. I did bring along, not merely to show that I have some big books at home, but I did bring along some books. I believe the Quran is a very important sacred text to many people here, and I assume so to Hamza, as he told me, I think that this is the word of God, of Allah. That type of thought worries me hugely, and I'll say why in more detail in a moment, but it seems to me that you have to go to the Quran to check out where the truth is. Yeah? That worries me, because surely you should look around the world to see where the truth is, rather than thinking, in a book or books written many, many years ago under dubious circumstances, somehow they've got to capture the truth. That reminds me of another thought, which came about when Hamza was talking. He implied, maybe rightly, that humanists, that atheists changed their values over the centuries. Do remember how interpretations of this book get changed over the centuries and between different groups. So the idea that there's some fixed morality here is a bit of a myth, because as we know, many, many religious people over many, many centuries have actually changed their mind about where the morality is, about the interpretations of books such as this one. I have no objection to this book. It's a book, it's written by a man, no doubt, or men, maybe women, but that's unlikely, seeing I think the book says men are superior to women, which again might be something which you're now changing. I can quote you if you want, but some of you who disagree with that will doubtless say it's a mistranslation or misinterpretation, so I won't go along that route. All I have to do is place my cards on the table with regard to saying that eminent Muslim scholars argue about what the truth is inside this book. It is therefore not a reliable source of morality. It is not a secure indicator. Were it to be so, you wouldn't all be arguing about exactly what it meant. Were Allah to be great, he could surely speak more clearly. Another holy book is, of course, the Holy Bible. The Old Testament, very fond of by the Jews, the New Testament by the Christians. Again, there's some agreements between this book and this book. I only happen to have a bigger book here because I happen to have a Christian background, although I'm an atheist, and I could get the sympathy vote by saying when my mother was in her twilight years, even though I'm an atheist, I happily bought her a big print Bible because she was a Christian. Once again, that manifests the fact, though, that as a humanist and atheist, we don't object to people having Christian beliefs or Muslim beliefs. Our objection is when it leads to further complications in society, which is a very important point. So once again, we are easygoing, we like to be courteous, we don't want to be offensive, though we get very, very upset by the fact that some Muslims can get very offended by little cartoons of Mohammed, and yet we atheists, we're not meant to get offended when we are told, hey, if you don't believe in Allah, you might go to hell, which occurs in some of the passages in the Quran. But again, we're easygoing. You made that mistake. We won't go to hell because there is no hell, but nor is there heaven, I'm afraid. In fact, I was pleased about that, but that's another story. So I've given two religious books. I could, of course, give scriptures to do with Hindu, to do with Buddhism and so on. Here's one to do with Taoism. There's some fine passages in here. I'm amazed that Hamza thinks only the Quran has got some fine writing inside it. There's fine writing inside Shakespeare, inside the Bible. I won't go as far as to say inside my books, but my books have some quips. And I'm very pleased at Hamza at mentioning them so often, because it might mean you might buy one or two, then that means I get 50p, or maybe £1. And times are hard, so every 50p counts. And if you want more jokes, there's always, can a robot be human? Oh, I better not go through the list. But I've wanted also to bring some other books. Here's another great book. Plato's Dialogues. Many, many non-believers, many atheists and many religious believers dip into this book. They find interesting arguments. Yes, and there are many interesting arguments. They find some of the passages wonderfully written, and there are many wonderfully written passages. The big difference between, dare I say, this big book and, in this particular edition, this little book, is that people who read this book tend to think the truth has got to be found in this book, whereas we, as humanists, as atheists, will say, no, Plato will get things wrong, he may get some things right, but it's there to discuss. So we have books rather than the book. Not that I'm into numbers, but we have more numbers than the Muslims do, because at the end of the day, you think the truth has got to be found in here, whereas we think, well, we've got to read lots of things, experiment in the world, so I'm very fond of John Stuart Mill, another book. But nonetheless, I don't think the truth is in here because it's written by Mill. I don't think the truth is in here because it's written by Plato, in contrast to many religious people who say, we must find it inside the Quran, or we must find it inside the Holy Bible. I could, of course, add and say, really, you should find it inside my book on humanism, but that would be a cheap jibe. Blank. He's going blank now. I'm making those points, though, to start getting into the main part of my discussion and my objection to the Hamzarian line, if I may call you the Hamzarian line. I notice again, though, that with regard to my live and let live, I'm happily drinking from the mug, which talks about Islamic educational and research projects. And so, once again, we are happy with that. But my main concern relating to that is to do with truth. Maybe Hamza's happy just to be happy, but some of us value truth. Some of us value investigation. Some of us value research. To look for the truth, to engage in research, to investigate, you need to be open-minded and look around the world. You need to deploy your reason. You are not going to look for the truth. You are not going to be able to work out how things should be and how things are by saying, it must be found inside this particular book. It may be helpful to look at this book, but it's a mistake, surely, to think the truth must reside in here. It is just a book written by a human being or beings. The danger, if you are a religious believer, though, is that because you are a religious believer, you do actually think this book has been written by Allah in some strange way. And so, given you've got that, to my mind, mistaken belief that there's this great power behind it, you are committed to thinking, it must be in here, the answers must be here. That's one clear danger of religion. Namely, you are not genuinely going to be looking for the truth if you are committed to saying it's all inside this one book. Or at least, whatever the truth is, has got to be coherent with this one book. Obviously, there are many interpretations of this one book, as we've come across, many disputes about it. And so, in as far as we get some human interpretations of it, some compassionate interpretations, then I'd say that's because you're using your humanity to interpret it. We know there are many nasty interpretations which result from this book. We know there are many nice interpretations which result. What's the difference? Well, I say those who produce the nice interpretations actually have started paying attention to their human feelings of fellow feeling, empathy, compassion, reason and experience. And that's why they interpret this book, so that they don't want to chop off hands, maybe, if some people read it in this way, or that they don't want to stone adulteresses, or whatever the story is. So one big area which I'd stress is that if you think you're going to be better off with religion, you're not going to be better off with regard to access to the truth. Because access to the truth requires investigation and does not require commitment to one particular book. Before Hamza would doubtless say to me, we have lots of other books too, but I believe from Hamza, he said it himself, these are the words of God, of Allah, and so presumably it all comes back down to this. And I gather, but I haven't read it in detail, I haven't read it much at all, but I gather, I suspect many of you haven't read it much at all, to be honest, but I gather there are many nasty things in there, but you, of course, try to rewrite it in a different way, now that you are more humane. I'm not sure why I talk about you, as I'm sure only a few of you are Muslims, but I make the same comments, exactly the same comments with regard to the Bible. There are many nasty things in here. Christ, in fact, had it in for animals because he cast the devils into a herd of pigs and sent them flying off the edge of a cliff. Not too good for the pigs, I feel. So if you're interested in animal rights and so on, then I wouldn't be a Christian. Also, I noticed I was at a debate the other week that he wasn't too keen on the fig tree. He was looking at a fig tree and it didn't have any figs on it. It probably wasn't in season, so he withered it. Poor fig tree, just like that. These things worry me. Although many Christians will say we should follow Christ's way, I don't think you should follow his way with regard to pigs, with regard to the fig tree, nor indeed should you follow his way with regard to saying that if you do not follow him, you'll be cast into eternal damnation, which I think is a sort of thing which was also said by Mohammed, but I am open to correction. That leads me into my second big area. My first big area was truth. My second big area of concern is morality. I suppose I immediately have the thought that it is amazing to me that many Christians can be committed to the idea that non-believers will suffer an eternal damnation when those non-believers might be their parents or might be their children or their close lovers or friends, because it seems horrendous that you could actually live a life in which you are foretelling that some of your closest, nearest and dearest would end up with eternal hell or damnation. I don't know, again, what the particular stance is of Muslims about hell and damnation. I'm sure there's many disagreements. I'm often amazed by how Christians and Muslims, some of them seem to know what's going to happen in the afterlife with such detail, when, of course, from my viewpoint, there is no afterlife, but even if you believe there is one, presumably you haven't really got the foggiest what it would be like. I suspect it would be rather tedious, sort of going through these lectures time and time again, but you never know. Hamza is such a fine speaker, you might enjoy listening to Hamza for an eternity. I think Hamza would enjoy listening to Hamza for an eternity. I'm just getting my own back for the little quip about my being easy, but then I live in Soho, so I am easy. Returning to the second point, the first point was true, the second point was to do with morality. Returning to the morality issue, yes, Hamza is perfectly right. You're bound to be right by mistake sometimes. Hamza is perfectly right that I really think there are some objective moral truths. For example, it was objectively morally wrong to kill however many millions of Jews or Poles were killed during the Second World War. Full stop. I'm not sure if this is going to be a good example, but if I just started for the sheer fun of it to stick pins in Hamza against his will, or to start slicing off bits of his ears against his will, or to start chopping off his fingers or pulling his fingernails. Hold on, if I chopped off the fingers, pulling the fingernails isn't very relevant, but if I pulled off the fingernails first, then chopped off the fingers. I started doing lots of nasty things to Hamza for the sheer fun of it, and I hasten to say against his will. He hasn't paid me to do it because he has a particular fetish. I haven't asked you about your fetishes yet. But suppose I were to be doing that, I would say that I was just doing something morally wrong, full stop. That's a particular case in which something is morally wrong, full stop. And I suspect all of you here, whatever your feelings about Hamza, you'd agree. I ought not to harm somebody for the sheer fun of it against their will. Isn't that true? That surely is true. Humanists can recognize that truth. I suspect most religious people can recognize that truth as well. Why is that an amazing truth? Well, it's not an amazing truth. Human beings are such that they can spot that moral truth, full stop, just as human beings are such that they can spot many mathematical truths. Human beings have evolved in such a way that they can see grass as being green. They can count the number of people inside a room. That doesn't mean the number of people inside a room hangs on their evolutionary powers. It doesn't mean that grass being green hangs on the evolution of human beings. All it means is that human beings have evolved in such a way that they can perceive these things about grass or about trees or about planets or whatever. And another thing we can perceive is a set of certain moral truths. I'm very wary at having big general moral principles. I know some religious people and some humanists and atheists like big general moral principles, but I think they're normally very shallow. They normally have so many caveats. I much prefer looking at particular cases and seeing where the truth lies. Hence, I gave you that particular case with Hamza. I noticed there wasn't much support for you, Hamza, when I was talking about pulling off your fingernails and so on. I thought they'd all be shouting, no, no, don't do that to our Hamza. But never mind. Perhaps there are exceptions even to that simple example. Why I have it in a little bit for general moral principles is I suspect many of you might well believe, everyone has a right to life. But that doesn't mean much, does it? That doesn't actually affect your behaviour much if it doesn't follow that therefore everyone has a right to the means to life. I suspect all of us here have many luxuries which we don't at all need in order to live, and yet we prefer having our luxuries towards helping many people in other countries who are really starving and under great pain and stress in abject poverty. Somewhere along the line we compromise, somewhere along the line we say, oh well, I'd rather have my DVD player or I'd rather have a holiday than actually help somebody whose life is on the line. That applies to humanists, to atheists, as much as to Muslims, as much as it is to Christians. I'm merely making the point that to say, oh well, we're a religious believer, or I'm a humanist, I think everyone has a right to life, is pretty vacuous, it's pretty empty when we don't do much about it. Yeah? All of us, to reiterate, at times think we much rather have various frills, various luxuries, various privileges, rather than helping people whose life is at stake. So we don't really think the right to life is paramount. If we did, we'd be changing our behaviour. This applies, as I said, to non-believers and believers alike. I'm merely making the point that to say, hey, we've got these big moral principles from religion, they don't count for much if it doesn't affect your behaviour much. Furthermore, with regard to the morality issue, and then I'll go on to my third point, then I'll end. With regard to the morality issue, it's strange how many religious believers think there can only be moral or ethical principles if there is a divine lawgiver. But surely, why you should be doing what is morally right in the interests of the person whom you're trying to help? You ought not to be doing it because God tells you to do it. You ought not to be doing it as a means of getting to heaven. If you are truly morally concerned, as I'm sure many of you, perhaps all of you are, what you are really doing is you are helping somebody for their sake, not being motivated towards getting to heaven or pleasing Allah or whatever the story is. Furthermore, there's a famous argument which Hamza hasn't mentioned, but it's a bit iffy as an argument. But you can always ask, why does God command what he commands? If he just commands anything which crosses his mind, so to speak, then why count it as being good? If, on the other hand, he only commands what is good, then already the existence of good is independent of God's commands. In other words, you've got the same problems with morality if you just say it comes down from God as you have if you say it comes from humankind. There still is the issue about what makes good good. And that's as difficult for God, so to speak, as for us. Time is getting on. I'm sure we're all getting bored. And for some of us, of course, that means we want to go off and have a drink. But maybe this doesn't apply to all of you. There hasn't the Eid just been over or something? Yes, vaguely. I heard some story about a whole restaurant was filled with people, filled with Muslims last night, eating away eagerly. But my third point, though, is to do meaning. Many religious believers somehow think their lives cannot have meaning without their belief in God or Allah. I believe that's true. Many religious believers say, yeah, what gives meaning to my life is my children or my job or my work, but nonetheless, what's the point of it all unless I have eternal life of some format or other with God? I think that's a dreadful idea because, A, it's intellectually dubious, because if it really is the case that something can only have meaning if it refers to something outside of itself, then that would have to apply to God as well. If you say, what's the point of it all? Then you can ask that question of God or Allah. What's the point of God? What's the point of Allah? If you think, well, somewhere along the line things don't have to have points, it's just valuable in themselves, then that can apply to humanity. I was reminded a little earlier on about how Tony Hancock had inside one of his sketches the idea on his gravestone, he came, he went, in between, nothing. Well, maybe that describes some of our lives, such as mine, but nonetheless I think many, many people do find meanings to their lives with regard to their children or their projects, gardening or writing or artistry or such. And that just is meaningful, full stop. It's a mistake to think that meaning can only come about through religious belief, through in particular thinking you're going to have eternal life. If this life somehow lacks meaning, then I assure you an eternal life would also lack meaning. Arguably it will be worse, as it will be boring. Mind you may think that's happening at the moment, but I hope it's not too bad. So let me just summarize then. I actually feel Hamza gave a very, very excellent silver-tongued speech, but he ran through lots and lots of issues, many of which were incredibly iffy with regard to the economic models and so on. Who knows what Islam is meant to say about economics? Who knows what Christianity is meant to say about economics? I do know that with regard to the interest issue on money deposited, many, many Muslims find ways round it by going through various little loopholes, so that therefore technically it's not on deposit but is invested, but ends up having the same security as if it were on deposit. But I'm not just blaming the Muslims on that, I blame the Christians equally. At times in the Bible, I believe, you're not meant to receive interest on money, yet nonetheless, obviously they now accept it very happily. With regard then to the economic models, the sociology stories from Hamza and so on, I think these are empirical claims. Who knows? You certainly cannot draw the conclusion that life is better off with religion, not least because I take it Hamza would strongly disapprove of some of the other religions, and the title is about religion in general. I suppose I should try to sum up. I'm tempted to make the point, that I often do make this point, but here might well seem to be the case, that when someone such as Peter Cave burbles along, it's rather just a way of passing the time. But as Samuel Beckett said, time would have passed anyway. So I'm not intending just to burble. I am intending to make three very serious points, despite, dare I say, the iffiness of some of Hamza's comments. The three deep, serious points which I really would want you to think about is, if you are concerned with truth, if you are concerned with investigating how the world goes and how it should go, you ought not to think the answers must rest inside one particular book. In the case of many people here, the Quran, or in the case of a few people here, the Bible. These books may be of interest to look at. Some of the words are very fine, some of the words are pretty nasty, but nonetheless, you will not find the truth in one book. It's bizarre to think one book written many, many years ago, many centuries ago, under strange conditions, somehow is going to give the truth about these matters. That is not in line with your reason and your experience. So I would urge that as being the first main point. The second main point is simply with regard to morality. If you base your morality in God, in belief in God, then for a start it's dangerous, because if you lose your belief in God, you may think anything goes. And often atheists and humanists are accused of that, but that's a mistake. If you cease believing in God, or if you never have believed in God, nonetheless, being human beings, you have a sense of compassion, a sense of fellow feeling, a sense of reason, of evidence, of fairness. Think of young children. They straight away seem to have an idea of it's fair or it's not fair. That's just the way we are built. Thirdly, the meaning of life issue. Many religious believers somehow think this world isn't good enough. We have got to go beyond it in order to find meanings to our lives. A, there isn't a beyond, but B, this world is good enough, and so I hope not many of us are in the Tony Hancock position of just thinking he came, he went, in between nothing. Or there's another Samuel Beckett line, which maybe applies to me. One participant club says to Ham, "Do you believe in the life to come?" And Ham replies, "All my life's been a life to come," wearily. But nonetheless, I'm sure many of you can have meaningful lives, but they don't become meaningful because of a mistaken belief in an eternal life. If this life cannot have meaning for you, then an eternity of life won't have meaning for you either. So, my conclusion then is really, let's have an enjoyable debate, and let me persuade you to then have a glass of wine afterwards, but maybe that won't go down well. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Cave. We will now have the rebuttal session where Hamza will go first, and he will have 7 to 10 minutes to rebut some of the arguments put across by Peter, and then Peter will likewise have the option to rebut some of the arguments that Hamza made in this section and also during his talk. So
is that a re-rebut?
Maybe re-squared.
Another level of rebut.
Re-squared, but
re-squared, but
I'm a mathematician, so that's how it works for me.
Okay, I don't have much time. I'd like to thank Peter Cave for being...
Peter Cave, really? Yeah.
Sorry?
For being Peter Cave?
Just for being?
Yeah, for being. Because you didn't say much. The reason I'm saying that because you didn't respond to any of my arguments. You just say, it doesn't make sense, it's economic model, what does that mean? Well, you have your time to speak in a minute, sir. And also you were talking about
much for debate.
Well, it has to be done in a structured manner, obviously. So you asked about my fetish. I think if I did have a fetish, it would be responding to humanists like yourself. That's why I always enjoy being in this position. Now let me quickly go to some of his points and some of his outdated cliches with regards to God and religion. First, he talked about the problem of evil. How dare a religious person who believes in this transcendental cause that caused the whole universe, how can he believe in such a loving and good God if there's so much evil in the world? Well, there's a problem here. And the problem is that if God doesn't exist, then objective right and wrong doesn't exist, which you never addressed in from my presentation. However, objective morality does exist, which you admitted to. Evil exists, objective evil exists, therefore God exists. So what I've done is I've explained evil, the existence of evil with the existence of God, but I don't have to explain how and why. But at least I've explained that those two things are logically compatible. So I think that's an undercutting defeater to your outdated cliche with regards to God. Similarly, you said about economic model. It sounds nice and dandy, all the points I mentioned about Islam and its economic model dealing with poverty and the financial crisis and everything, the world and his wife. Or in the humanist world and his husband. Now, the issue I'm trying to make is that, again, there's another fallacious claim. Well, look at the Islamic world. Well, I was talking about political principles here. If you can show me, and I'm happy for you to do that, to go into the Muslim world and find the Islamic political principles that they are adopting. Because I even mentioned Saudi Arabia saying that they're not adopting a certain injunction from the Prophet himself to give money from the oil revenues to the people. So you just swiftly, again, an outdated cliche. Third point, you talk about dubious statistics and sociological evidence. I didn't focus on happiness. That wasn't my focus. I talked about better mental and physical health, philanthropy, altruism, and I showed you a positive correlation. Statistically robust, peer-reviewed academic journals. You can't just say they're all rubbish and nonsensical just because you don't like them. You're talking about calling for truth. Doesn't make much sense to me. Second point, you're talking about morality and saying how we get to know morals. It's in the Quran. Why do you base it in the Quran? Well, funny enough, my argument wasn't about moral epistemology. It was about moral ontology, the basis for morality. For you to say that pulling my fingernails and pulling my hair and torturing me against my will is objectively morally wrong, for you to say that, there must be a God. Because there's no other conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity, something you didn't deal with again. The other point you talked about is the divine command theory, also known as Euthyphro's dilemma, Plato's dilemma. Now, many philosophers such as Philip Quinn, Robert Adams, William Aston and William Craig, they expose this false dilemma, adding a third alternative. And what do they say? They say our moral duties are commanded by a loving and good God, and God's very nature, and his nature is determinative of what good is in the first place. Now, one may argue, why do you choose God as the being that determines good? Well, by definition, God is the only thing worthy of worship. And what is worthy of worship is something that is morally perfect. So I think that breaks the dilemma. The other point you made about voluntary euthanasia and homosexuality, again, value claims and moral judgments about certain things. You presume them as if they're objective in nature in the humanistic perspective, which there's even difference of opinion amongst humanists and atheist scholars with regards to euthanasia and things like abortion and other things like homosexuality. And I would argue, where is your standard? You don't even have a standard. How can you come here and just say these things are right and wrong when you don't even have a standard? I don't tell you. Without God, your morality is meaningless. It's ephemeral. It's like the lion when he rips the blood, he rips the neck of a deer and drinks its blood. We don't say, hey, that lion is acting immorally. No, it's not murder. He's following his instincts. And what does evolution say? The basis for your morality. What does it say? It says we're just animals. And if you think human beings are something special, then you're talking about speciesism, the unjustified bias for a certain particular species, which is unjustified. And evolution does say we're just matter or animals, and if that's the case, then it doesn't really matter, does it? So, the other points you made about the Quran. the truth is just in the Quran, so we're blind faith. It's quite funny because the Quran is probably, in my opinion, the only religious book that points to the outside world. Have you not seen the things in the creation, the heavens and the earth? Ponder, reflect. يَتَفَكَّرُونَ in Arabic. Those who reflect has a deep meaning. You're not just a desert romantic touching the sand and looking at the stars. Rather, this word means the thing that you're reflecting upon, inquire about its implications. This is why there's an unprecedented history when Islamic governance was in place of progress. That's why the historian P.S. Butler, he said, no historical student of the culture of Western Europe can ever reconstruct for himself the intellectual values of the latter Middle Ages unless he possesses a vivid awareness of Islam looming in the background. John W. Draper, in his book, The Intellectual Development of Europe, I have to deplore the systematic manner in which the literature, I've ripped the page to give, there it is, the rest of it. The systematic manner of the literature of Europe has continued to put out of sight our obligations to the Mohammedans, i.e. the Muslims. Surely they cannot be no longer hidden. And many of these books that he was showing, the philosophical works, if it wasn't for the Muslims who preserved them and translated them for Western Europe, you would never be reading them today. My next point. You talked about heaven and hell. And, why would God send people to heaven and hell if they just don't believe? Well, in the Islamic tradition, it's not that you just don't believe. You have to be an active rejecter. So proof has to come to you, whatever proof constitutes for you, and you have to reject it. And that deserves punishment. Just like crime, someone commits a crime in any society, they get punished. This is the regulation of metaphysical law. Something which, to me, sounds very fine. Because if you actively reject something to be totally true, then you've devalued humanity itself. As you said, you've taken truth away. Next point. You talked about the punishments and stoning and cutting the hand of the thief. Well, you've presumed an individualistic philosophy on crime and punishment. I don't have to accept your philosophy in order to make value judgments about punishments, because Islam doesn't view things from an individualistic premise. As the feminist philosopher, yes, I'm a Muslim and I'm quoting a feminist, the feminist philosopher Marilyn Friedman, she says, individualism is you're viewing the self, the individual, as an abstract entity divorced from social obligations. And once you do that, it leads to what, in the words of the Roundtree Trust and the Children's Society, it leads to social breakdown and decay, which we've seen today. And it's what Islam does, it actually says cohesive values in society, and you view society as an indivisible whole. So sometimes you have to have suitably harsh punishments to rectify the problems that we can't find the solutions even in the contemporary world today. And you're talking about meaning. Well, this is quite funny because according to the atheist worldview, there is no meaning at all to life. Because what do the scientists say? What do they say? They say basically that there's going to be a heat death. The universe is going to die. The sun is going to burn us out eventually. So we're on the Titanic. We're on a sinking ship. So you're saying to me, shake the hand of the old lady or give someone a glass of wine and maybe reshuffle the deck chairs on the sinking ship. But it doesn't really make sense because it's just a sinking ship. What religion does is something different. It says, do great things here, and you're also going to get great things in the hereafter too, which is something quite plausible. Philosophically, I don't think there's any problem here. Also, you talked about the fine writing. I think this was an attack to an attempt, and a very superficial attempt, to discuss my argument about the miracle of the Quran, which you never addressed again, or about the philosophy of miracles. You said, oh, it's fine writing. But the issue is, I never said that the Quran is fine writing. I like Shakespeare. Oh Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, O Romeo? Deny thy father and deny thy name. I don't have a problem with this. I was brought up in Shakespeare. I'm a Brit. So the issue is, I'm talking about the unique structural features of the Quran which cannot be naturalistically explained. And we could discuss this in our Q&A also. So it's not about aesthetic reception. It's about objective, observable features in the Arabic language. One more point, I think you made quite a few points. One more point I'd like to make is a final point, which is quite interesting, about interpretation. Humanity obviously has different perspectives on things. Differences of opinion or of interpretation are not unique to religious discourse. Rather, it's a human phenomena again. Even in secular law, because the Quran is not only a spiritual book about morality and how to live your life, it's a legal book also. And a legal book, you require tools of interpretation, which the Quran details how to interpret it for you. Similarly, in secular law and UK statute law, you need 4 rules of interpretation. The golden rule, the literal rule, the mischief rule, and the purposive rule. And these are rules in order to extract law from secular text. So if you deny that for the Quran as a legal code, are you denying that for the secular code? Of course not. And I am, just to finalize, I think I've addressed most of your points. One thing I would like to say is, the question is, can we live better lives without religion? Not can we live truer lives without religion. There is a big difference. So I'd like to point out to you, Mr. Peter Cave, that please address my arguments, which just to add, the evidence on sociology in a less rhetorical way, more of a nuanced discussion, the philosophy of miracles with regards to the Quran, also objective morality. You didn't address that. You went to epistemology and how we can get to know morals and what we can feel. And you said, well, torturing someone is just wrong. I don't think that's an argument. It just is. Well, I could just come to the podium and say, well, God just is, Islam just is, the Prophet Muhammad just is. That's not an argument. You can't have your cake and eat it. Also, about the political aspects in Islam with regards to economy. You didn't deal with any of the 6 points that I raised. Finally, I really like to say that the statement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, when he said the cure to ignorance is actually to ask and learn. And I do ask you to proceed in that light. Thank you very much for listening.
Peter Cave, you now have 7 to 10 minutes to rebut the rebuttal, I guess.
Well, once again, I wonder, how can I follow that? Then I think, how can I follow that? I'm not sure if many of us can follow it. You mentioned so many things, Hamza. And so, were I to be an economist, I'd start dealing with your arguments about how to run a society on an economic basis. But I'm not an economist, and I'm amazed that in about 5 or 10 minutes you managed to explain how the world's economies could be sorted out by following an Islamic way. Whereas I'm not sure how you even find that Islamic way. I assume, but I might be wrong, that the Quran does not mention a particular level of taxation, which you seem to mention in your discussion at one point. I assume the Quran didn't say, oh, well, if you flog the oil, then you won't have to, you'll get about 20,000 a year. Because, of course, if you flog the oil from the Middle East, then other people are having to work in order to pay for it. So you were just throwing in claims which seem pretty random to me, or arbitrary. And yes, I'd be happy to find an economist to debate with you your claims about economics from Islam, but I'm in no position to do so, and I'm happy not to do so. Because I thought we were really looking at the deeper questions about religion, namely about how it is better to live or not with regard to religious values. I suppose I still am baffled by how you very casually say, with regard to morality, the standard is God. What does that mean? You criticize me for saying that there are some objective moral truths, such as I'm not so sure about this one now, not sticking pins in you against your will and so on, Hamza. But nonetheless, what does it mean to say God is the standard? That's a pretty empty comment unless you can draw conclusions about what that standard is. And as we have all agreed, it seems, that if you try to draw conclusions about what that standard is, you get radically different answers because you get different interpretations. In other words, it does not help your understanding of morality to say, oh, well, God sets the standard and you're an atheist, so you haven't got that standard. That's utterly pointless to say that, because if you read the Quran, if you read the Bible, serious scholars who do these things, they draw radically different morals with regard to the ones I mentioned, with regard to premarital sex, with regard to lusting, with regard to contraception, with regard to euthanasia, with regard to abortion. So it doesn't help, I repeat, to say the standard is God, unless you can say more about what that God standard is. In fact, you seem very interested, going back to the economics, to return us to the gold standard. I would have thought you would be keen to press the God standard. But I suppose you are. But your God standard doesn't help because we don't know what to draw conclusions from with regard to it. It's an interesting fact, though, that people who do interpret the Quran in different ways, people who do interpret the Bible in different ways and other religious texts, well, which ones do we go for? I would recommend, as a humanist, we go for those which cohere most with the idea of live and let live, encourage people to have flourishing lives, don't oppress people. Many religious believers, as I've said, do end up trying to impress and indeed oppress non-believers. And that's a big concern with regard to how a society should be run. And so that's why I'd strongly recommend, and I do recommend, a neutral state, a society which is not atheistic, but is not Islam, is not Christian either. It is a state which is neutral in the sense that it is not committed to one particular religion or non-religion. It holds the ring. I talk about the state as a ringmaster rather than a conductor. If the state is a religious conductor, it expects you, dare I say, to sing from the same hymn sheet. The sort of state which humanists, atheists, tend to prefer is a sort of state which is neutral on that issue. It's more like a ringmaster. He has certain very basic values which are there enshrined such that people can lead flourishing lives without oppressing others. That is not the sort of society which you find in Iran. That is not the sort of society you find in Saudi Arabia. It's fair comment, Hamza, to say, you can say quite reasonably, oh, well, they are not Islamic societies. That's fair enough. But then we can ask you, well, what would the Islamic society be? Would it insist on all its citizens being found guilty and being thrown into jail if they had an abortion? Would it insist that men should have certain rights over women? Would it insist that euthanasia be illegal? Would it insist that, premarital sex or going out unveiled if you are a woman would meet with lashes? These are things which you would need to answer. As a liberal, as a humanist liberal, my sort of state, my preferred state, is one to say, well, let people live their lives as they want, but don't allow them to oppress others. That's my neutral state, and so that's my response to your political point. With response to your concern, just to come back to the point you've made quite a few times, how can humanists have values? I mean, how can atheists or humanists, how can evolved beings, you might say, how can they ever sort of see the sun or watch the moon or know there are trees? Because they've evolved in such a way that they can spot trees, that they have visual receptors such that they see trees. Similarly, human beings have evolved in such a way that they have a sense of morality, just as they have a sense of mathematics. We don't have to start saying, oh, well, therefore there's a mathematical God, and we accept that there are mathematical truths in the world and there are moral truths. That relates to another idea which I think you may be putting over, and it applies to a few humanists, namely that they are materialists. Well, for a start, humanists are no more materialistic in the sense that they like getting fast cars and so on. They're not material in that sense. Yes, humanists often are materialists in a very particular philosophical sense, namely they think understanding of human beings is going to be enabled through understanding neural networks in the brains and so on. But many humanists, many atheist humanists, are not that way inclined. We accept that there's a whole way of understanding the world which does not get reduced to physics or to neurology. You can understand the world in a certain way by just looking at a wonderful sunset. You have a different understanding, a different appreciation of the world by falling in love. You can have a different understanding of the world by engaging in sexual congress. You can have an interesting understanding of the world by looking at Jackson Pollock's or Rothko paintings. Some people get a rather bizarre understanding of the world by watching Sex in the City. But nonetheless, there are different ways of understanding the world, and they are not thereby reducible to the movement of electrons or neural circuits or whatever the current transient scientific theory is. Humanists are not necessarily materialists even in that sense, and they certainly are not materialists in the sense of utilitarianism, of the very crude idea of just wanting pleasures. I'm sure you do know your utilitarianism well, Hamza, but a major utilitarian was the 19th century John Stuart Mill, and he said, "'Tis better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig." On occasions, I prefer to be the pig, but overall I'm on the side of John Stuart Mill, namely the idea of a flourishing life is not just to do with happy satisfactions or pleasures. It involves those, but it also involves the thought of aspiring, the thought of helping others, the thoughts of nobility, the thoughts of trying to overcome obstacles, of compassion and such like. I suppose one other point you kept getting at me over is I didn't address your miracle argument with regard to trying suddenly to show that Allah exists. I was quite amazed that you suddenly produced this argument and thought, there it is, 5 minutes flat, I've proved that Allah exists. Wow. Is it as simple as that, Hamza? I'm sure it's not. Just because I think you use the expression, the structure of this book is unique. I'm not sure what you mean by structure, but I doubt if the structure of the book is unique. But even if it is unique, that's irrelevant. The odd pebble is unique. There's no other pebble than this pebble. There's another pebble similar to it, but it's not this one. Uniqueness in itself does not manifest the idea of divinity. And as you yourself said, miracles in nature might just be perceived as slightly more complicated patterns of the laws of nature, of the regularities in nature, more complex patterns. Okay, the Quran is a part of that complex pattern of nature. There's no need to pop God in at the top of it. My very, very general point then, and I don't have it in regard, I hasten to say, I like to hedge my bets, I would like to put that on record, as Bertrand Russell maybe did at one point. But I would like to make a very, very basic point. Explanations have to come to an end. That's from the great Wittgenstein in the early 20th century. It's a very simple point. Explanations have to come to an end. The atheist, the humanist stance is to say, we can explain so much and then we come to an end on it. Nothing is gained by popping on an extra bit and saying, oh, well, therefore, it must actually be done by God or by Allah. Because at the end of the day, I suspect you, Hamza, are humble enough to say that Allah's ways are mysterious, Allah's ways are mystical. You certainly do not understand as a mere human being Allah's ways. So to try to explain the world and morality and the meaning of life by reference to something which is mysterious is no explanation at all. Explanations come to an end, and the end should rest in our humanity, our compassion, our fellow feeling, our reason, our fairness with regard to each other. So I'll vote for humanity, and I'll still vote for the red wine, rather than for some mysterious Allah or God, or indeed gods. Thank you.
So this is going to be your opportunity to ask questions directly to our participants, or you may choose to write it down on a piece of paper, whichever way you wish. And also this is the opportunity for even each of our participants to follow up on the question if they also see fit to do that. So if anybody wants to be the first person just to kick off proceedings. Yes, the person with the red top. Yes.
Basically, question to Hamza, I guess. There are many people who are religionists, and there are many people who believe in God, and there are many Muslims in the audience. So what? How does this then affect my behaviour? What am I supposed to do next? I accept your points. So what? What's next? How does it affect my behaviour?
Okay, that's a very good question. I mean, when any human being adopts a certain worldview about how they see the world, how they see man, women, life, universe, it actually inevitably shapes their behavior. And the reason it does that is because our concepts that we form from a set of ideas actually makes us reflect upon things in a certain way. I'll give you an example. As a Muslim, and this is just a subjective thing, what I'm saying, if, for example, I were to see that the majority of you were in inevitable crisis at the moment, I would, I hope, sacrifice myself to help you guys, if that meant the case, yeah? And the reason I'm doing that, because I truly objectively understand what philanthropic activity and altruism and self-sacrifice actually really mean. Because from the Islamic worldview, we do all our actions for the sake of God. Now someone may think, well, that sounds quite bizarre. Why can't you do it for their sake? But there's a problem in that, because if you have benefit-orientated actions, then if something better comes along, then the previous connection you had could be easily discarded. And that would also show that human beings have extrinsic value, not intrinsic value. Like extrinsic value means money you can use for an end, to buy something. So it has external, extrinsic value. But I believe things have intrinsic value because God exists and because what God says about humanity and life and the universe. So I would be able to do that. Do you see my point? So that's a specific example. Similarly, it also shapes our political view. Peter Kay talked about that he is a liberal, which I don't want to build straw men, but my personal understanding of what a liberal is someone who adopts a basic philosophical premise of individualism. Because if you see the European history when the Catholic Church used the coercive arm of the state to oppress thinking and the masses, and there was huge wars, the 30-year wars, the 80-year wars, the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day, etc. And that created an environment where thinkers had to come out and say, well, we need to develop an individualist doctrine on humanity and rights. So that's where you had the birth of individualism, which formed the premise for liberalism. Now, I disagree with that premise totally. And that's why I see crime and punishment, for example, in a more different perspective. One could call it collective plus individualistic at the same time. Whereas a liberal perspective would say, oh my God, cutting the hand of a thief is so barbaric and wrong. Without having a nuanced discussion and say, well, the basis for your philosophy for crime and punishment is individualistic. You just see the human being as sovereign with hardly any attachments, philosophical attachments and obligations to society. I see it differently. My worldview is different. I see society as an integral whole. My actions affect society, and society actions affect the individual. Hence, crime and punishment will be different. And that's why we should always understand our worldview. And the question is a great question, because adopting a worldview and a perspective has huge implications. And the ones that I've just given you hopefully were more practical. Thank you.
Just a couple of words. For a start, it isn't, I suppose it's more than a couple already, but just a few words. For a start, the liberal isn't committed to individualism in the sense in which you do it. The liberal obviously does have a sense of community, has a sense of concern for their family, for wider circles, for maybe their gardening club, or maybe their local authority. So it's a false dilemma to suggest either you're an individual liberal or alternatively you've got to be a communitarian. Secondly, you casually come back to this chopping off hands, Hamza. So I'm not sure about your Islamic view, but it would be interesting to know then, are you saying that you really do think that thieves should, maybe by the third time, should have hands removed? Do you, for example, believe that adulteresses should be stoned? I gather in the Saudi Arabia constitution it's got to be medium-sized stones so that neither they're so trivial, but nor does the death occur too quickly. That's actually in the constitution, I believe. But presumably you're going to disagree with that, but as you seem so clear about the nature of punishment from Allah, perhaps you'll give us some examples of what punishment you think there should be. I, as a wishy-washy liberal, feel very uneasy about punishment, but I recognise we have to do it, so I could discuss it happily with you.
I mean, that's a question to you. That's obviously a question to myself. I mean, as I said, the things that you pass value judgments on, the first thing is, I don't think I should even maybe entertain a conversation with you on this issue because, again, you don't have an objective basis for your values, as you said.
But you do, so tell us.
That's why I'm going to answer the question.
Help us, yes.
I will help you, indeed. But I just want to make that point and reiterate it again and again that where is your standard? However, let me talk to you about my standard. And the situation is very simple.
I talk about humanity's standard.
Sure. I mean, the representative for humanity on my right, ladies and gentlemen. As if people of religion are not part of the human race. I am from Greece, I guess, so. Okay, wow. The situation is this. First and foremost, in the Islamic narrative, we don't view things from an individualistic lens. And I wasn't claiming that you don't have family bonds and ties, no. I was talking about your political philosophy is viewed via the prism of individualism. So when you see crime and punishment, you say the individual rights and individual freedoms. I particularly disagree with that because individualism doesn't necessarily have to be true. And there's many reasons why it's not true. One of the reasons include that we know from developmental psychology that we're going away from the Piaget view on children are developed just on their own as the individualist constructor via individualism. No. Actually, the child develops his cognitive or her cognitive abilities via social links and attachments. So individualism from the onset is totally inaccurate. So there's other reasons why individualism is a flawed concept, which is quite interesting in the last 20 years of humanitarian critique. But that's another discussion. So Islam doesn't adopt that view. It adopts, I think, a more corrective view, which sees individuals as part of society and society as part of individuals. So now, there's an effect now. Individual actions do affect behavior, and societal pressures do affect behavior also. The point is, what you shouldn't do though is just make Islamic law a comprehensive legal system and just sex it up. I think it's awful. You just make it you make a caricature of it. Just imagine this. There's Tesco's down the road. There's a sister with a hijab and the cloak, the jilbab. And there's a brother with a very long beard. He has a sword down his jacket. There's a poor guy who's just stolen a cookie because he's hungry. He runs out of Tesco's. The sister trips him over. The man with the beard pulls out the sword and says, Allahu Akbar! And cuts the hand. This is a caricature of a comprehensive legal system. I mean, you've jumped into the narrative of Sky News and Fox News, and as a philosopher, I thought you wouldn't do that. However, you did. Let me just finish my point and you can come back to me. Honestly, I will give you the time. Because if you go to my Greek village, ask for the time, they go... So we have plenty of time. So what happens, so what I'm trying to say is, it's not a caricature. So what we say is, Islam decides to say we're not going to have a principal distance of the conception of the good life. Liberalism says you shouldn't really teach people what a good life is. Don't have that conception. No, but Islam says no, there are certain things which are objectively good and we must propagate them in society. So cohesive values such as justice, mercy, compassion, things that Peter Cave thinks he has a monopoly on, like humanism is all about compassion and justice and mercy. So we propagate these cohesive values. Not only do we propagate them, but we politicize them and everyone knows about them. You hear them on media, TV, teaching, etc. And on top of that, you have a very strong justice system. Whereas we don't believe as Muslims beyond reasonable doubt. Because doubt is in that sentence. We say it has to be almost as if it's virtually impossible. And there's, for example, for cutting the hand of the thief, where he had to steal out of greed. Not because he was hungry, because it's the duty of the state to provide these things for every individual. Unlike you see in liberal Britain, we have 90,000 homeless people. Whereas in the Islamic governance, what it does, it says, you're homeless, have a house. You're homeless, have some money. And it's taken from the Bait al-Mal, which is the state bank. But that's another discussion. So my point is then you have 19 conditions, for example, according to some classical scholars, on when you can cut the hand of a thief, after having all these stringent criteria. So when you see it, you say, wow, it seems to me that it's a suitably harsh punishment that acts as a deterrent. And I think that's a very unique way of crime and punishment, something that we haven't seen in any society before. And when you go and look into the justice system in history, if you read the works of Amnon Cohen, he looked at 1,000 sigil records of Jewish records living under Islamic governance. They had the freedom to choose the rabbinical courts, Christian courts, or Islamic courts. But most of the time, they chose the Qadi, which is the Islamic judge, because they knew justice lived under Islamic values. So when you see it as a comprehensive model, and we could discuss this forever, but when you see it as a comprehensive model, you actually see now, you know what? It's not that caricature anymore. I may disagree with it, but it does seem workable. That's why Clive Hollin, a very famous criminologist, he actually said, we have to start looking at the facilitating factors for crime. Rather than keep on doing the liberal view, which is have another law, and another law. It's quite funny when liberals go to so-called Islamic countries and they say, all this bad stuff is because of Islamic values. But when they see the 167 rapes a day, according to Amnesty International UK, of women in this country, and 1 in 4 women of domestic violence being abused in this country, and there's more likelihood of a man reporting a sick dog to the RSPCA than a woman being battered by her husband. It's atrocious. And they say, well, we need new laws. But they don't even go to the underlying values of the particular society. The Children's Society Report, a liberal group, What did they say? They said, we're suffering from excessive individualism, which in my opinion is the premise of liberalism. So I hope I've demystified it for you a bit. Thank you.
You made a little slur saying I thought I had a knocking on justice and fairness and so on. That isn't true. I think you are, well, maybe a kindly human being, certainly a human being, and I suspect kindly. And many religious believers are, and so obviously they have a sense of justice and fairness. My point is to say you're not finding it necessarily through your religious books, you're finding it through your humanity. And I note, though, that I'm still not clear that either you are saying that you think chopping of hands in certain circumstances is the right punishment. I know you don't say whether you think stoning of adulteresses should be allowed. And I assume then, once again, you're being very unclear whether the particular stonings, the particular hands removals which occur in various Islamic countries, whether you're saying they've got it wrong, or they've got it right, or we don't know. I assume that these are good examples again of just trying to make the point that if you hang it all on the Quran and try to draw conclusions, you start having different interpretations. And so to say God sets the standard doesn't help, because at the end of the day you're just coming up with a particular version of hands chopping here but not there, stoning here but not here, or whatever the story is. Whereas I suppose as, dare I say, a liberal, but not thereby an individualist, I would think that punishment should be geared towards the idea of minimum suffering, maximum deterrence. But lots of ifs and buts, lots of muddling through, but not thinking it should be found inside one book.
Okay. Can I just quickly respond to that, if possible?
Of course, we could carry on forever.
Oh, well, just, I like talking to you.
I think maybe one sentence.
Okay, I'm going to allow, obviously, the audience to participate, but in terms of justice, I give an example. The Quran talks about justice, and not in the intuitive way. We want things in their place, fair play, as us Brits say. What the Quran also says is, even if it's against yourself. Now, that's not an intuitive kind of concept for justice, especially when you think you're going to get punished. Because the intuitive, especially I studied psychology at university, and the intuitive concept is, I'm going to get punished for something, I'm going to hide it. I'm actually not going to tell anybody, I'm going to, sweep it underneath the carpet. What does Islam say? It has, in my opinion, a greater view on justice. Even if it's against yourself, those you love, kith and kin, rich or poor. As the Quran says, God loves the just, And so the point is, views on justice are also quite dissimilar with liberal views. So I would, this argument of everything has to be intuitive and inside human being, I think it's wrong, because there is a necessity to learn from revealed knowledge. And I've given you an example of justice, which in my opinion is, on reflection, is something that is far more powerful.
Okay, I think we'll take one question from the written question, and we'll take one from the audience, inshallah. So this one is addressed to Peter. What is your purpose in life? Have you ever thought about why you were placed on the earth? Everything seems to have a purpose, whether it be machines, cars, etc. So what is the purpose of mankind?
I seem to have so many microphones now. Wow, it's as if I'm at the United Nations, which might be a better place to be. I'm just amazed. Why ever think everything must have a purpose? Many centuries ago, philosophers, scientists, common sense people, no doubt, thought that there must be a purpose why the moon goes round the earth, if they believed that at the time, or when at one point they believed the sun went round the earth. But now we don't think in terms of purposes there. We don't think the moon has a purpose or the sun has a purpose. We have standard mechanical explanations of their movements, which, as Hamza recognised, are in fact just patterns. And so, yes, we can talk about human beings having purposes. My purpose of coming here was to try to enlighten Hamza. I'm sorry I'm failing. But one day he'll see the light. This has been quippy. I'm perfectly happy for Hamza to have his beliefs, so long as they don't oppress mine. But human beings often have purposes. Possibly, in fact, I think utterly foolishly, my parents had a purpose in doing various sexual activities to have a son. Pity them to end up with me, but, they didn't foresee that. Sophocles famously said, maybe the blessed, the happiest are those never to have been born. And somehow I sometimes have sympathy with that. But I challenge the assumption then that everything must have a purpose. I think many things do not have purposes. What are the purposes of numbers, and hence, equally so, the whole universe does not have a purpose. And if you really think everything must have a purpose, and if you really believe in God or Allah, then you must ask yourself, so what's the purpose of Allah? And if you give an answer, say the purpose is X, then you must say, what's the purpose of X? Once you play that card of thinking everything must have a purpose, you'll come to no end. And as I said at the end of my little talk, explanations come to an end, and so many things we just accept happen without purposes.
Well, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. And I've said this in the previous debate. If you want to find out an answer to the question of what your purpose of life is, and then you say you find out, then you want to attribute purpose to God. I mean, if God is the best explanation for your purpose of life, then the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. Even in the philosophy of science, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. For example, the external world exists. You can't prove that. How do you know your brain is not in a vat and some crazy alien is just computing your brain? You just couldn't prove that. It's an assumption. It's a philosophically basic premise that you just have to accept in order for science to have any grounding. Similarly, even with the question of God best explains your purpose of life, well, that's the best explanation. You don't have to explain the best explanation. And also, I would argue the chairs you're sitting on do not have any cognitive features. They can't think and feel. But yet we attribute purpose to such a material, ephemeral object. Similarly, there is a moth somewhere in a forest that drinks the sap of a tree. And as it drinks, it excretes, it basically does a poo. Yeah?
I think they know what it means.
Yes.
It's empirical quality.
Yeah, of course. But funny enough, there's another moth underneath that moth that drinks its poo. And the purpose from its function, you can derive that if the poo were to trickle down the tree, the ants will follow the trail and eat the first moth. BBC for you. Our money goes somewhere. So the point is this, is that you never knew about this probably 2 minutes ago. But yet there's a purpose to something so insignificant. And it's only rational for me to make the assumption, if you like, that if we attribute purpose to physical things like this, or to living moths that we never knew about, that have the most ridiculous function and purpose, then surely something more dynamic and more special, like the human being, actually must have some form of purpose. Because as many famous atheist philosophers, they debated this question, said without God, there is no meaning. And so what they discussed was, shall we suicide? And it's actually in their works. That was one of their biggest questions. Shall we exist then, since there is no meaning? Because God is an objective conceptual anchor that transcends Peter's subjectivity.
I was very touched by the tale of the moth. I have some various friends who actually loathe moths because they eat away at their clothes. But I'm easy about moths as well. But in fact, I'm just easy. I'm just getting tired, really. There's a famous Peter Cook cartoon in which there's a barmaid and there's a man at the end of the bar and she says, "Bitter?" And he says, "No, just tired." But I'm never clear what Hamza's answers are. For a start, he keeps saying that I don't have objective values. I keep telling him I do, but there you are. We can't get anywhere on that one. But more importantly, on this particular question then, are you saying, Hamza, that the sun and the moon and mountains have purposes? And furthermore, as you seem to think everything must have a purpose, what is the purpose of God?
I'm not going to answer that question because God, by definition, is something that is transcendental, and for me to jump into the mind of God is the fallacy that some of the Greek philosophers did, and they got them in a big No, I don't actually. What I frankly do is use my ration to justify that the Quran can only be explained by a transcendental cognitive source, and hence what it says must be true. And I discussed the logic of submission, which you never countered in any shape or form, and you misconstrued my argument of the miracle of the Quran, saying it's just because of its uniqueness. No, I was saying when we go to the productive capacity of the nature of the Quran, which is the Arabic language, and we exhaust all possibilities, this has been done by some Jewish scholars on computers, we cannot create the literary form of the Quran. So we need a supernatural explanation. These are evidences for transcendence. You never dealt with this argument and many of the other arguments, and you swiftly say that I have objective morals, but that's just a statement. If you do have objective morals, which I believe you do, it's only because God exists. Because there is no other transcendent conceptual anchor that goes beyond human subjectivity. And it was an ontological question, not an epistemological, which is, how do I get to know morals, or what are morals? But the very fact that you believe killing an old woman for no reason is 100% morally wrong is because God exists. And I could give you the following logical format for you to understand a bit better, since you're a philosopher. 1. If God does not exist, objective morals do not exist.
I don't accept that premise.
Okay, well, you don't accept that objective morality exists?
No, I don't accept your premise. Namely, if God does not exist, then objective morality does
Okay,
exist.
well, we could easily discuss that premise. Okay. But I believe you have failed to show me how it does in absence of God, because I gave you 2 other options, which if there's another option, please let me know, which was evolution and social pressure. Evolution were just accidental byproducts of a long evolutionary process. Our morals are ephemeral. They're illusory because they're based upon something that's ever-changing, such as our biology. Secondly, social pressure, we discussed that as well. If you take social pressure as a basis for objective morality, then the implications are that it was okay to kill 6 million Jews because there was a consensus at the time for that to happen. I am asking you, where is the objective anchor for you to peg your morality, to say that it is true? Saying it just is not an explanation, because then I could be here and my good argument could be religion is better for your life because it just is, and that's not an argument, it's counter-discourse. Do you see my point?
Well, I make the same point. You end up, in effect, using that format of just saying that God just is. It doesn't help at all to say, oh, well, you need an anchor for morality. The anchor is God. Because then I can ask, well, what's the anchor for God? And you'll just say, well, God's his own anchor. Words to that effect, no doubt. And I'll make the same point about morality. Morality is its own anchor. Just as I, as an atheist, am, confident there is no God, I acknowledge there are mathematical truths. I don't have to say, oh, well, there needs to be an anchor for mathematical truths, God. Just I acknowledge that there are truths about how many people there are in this room. I don't have to say, oh, well, there must be an anchor for that, namely God. Similarly, I put morality on the same level. There are some moral truths. We are aware of them. We've become aware of them through evolutionary processes, just as we've become aware through evolutionary processes how to understand, the operation of alcohol on brains, for example, or how water is made up of H2O. But perhaps we should have more debate from the audience.
That's true. But just as a final point, if you don't mind, is that if you're saying evolutionary processes dictate the basis for our morality, well, what did Darwin say? Darwin said if it happened, for example, that we were sharks, then it would be morally okay to forcefully copulate with a female shark. So rape would be morally okay if we happen to be sharks. And that's the problem here. Even Darwin, which is the basis for the evolution theory, which I would even contest in the first place, just from a philosophical premise, because in the book Anthropic Cosmological Principle by Tipler and Barrow, they said that every stage of the evolution of the Homo sapien, the 10 stages, for example, for each stage to be true, the probabilities are 4 to the power of minus 360 to the power of minus 110,000. And that's every single stage. So it's highly improbable. So for me, if evolution is true, therefore it's a miracle. And thereby it proves God's existence.
Okay. One quick point. So it's an interesting conclusion from this, and I gather Hamza does not believe in evolution. He does believe in cutting off hands in certain circumstances, and I'm still awaiting the stoning example. I think the evidence is overwhelming in favour of evolution, and I think it's morally wrong to go around stoning adulteresses or adulterers, and I really think it's morally wrong for many countries to insist that women must go around unveiled, when I suspect many of them do not want to, but I recognise some do.
Well, that's cheap. It's probably as cheap as the wine that you've been referring to all day. I mean, the point is that, these kind of cheap rhetorical claims, I mean, I do speak a lot of rhetoric, I do have to admit, and it's, almost eloquent, yeah?
Yes, you do.
But the point is, at least I justify it with some substance also. I just don't make empty claims like it's morally bad, morally good. I actually give some justification for my model. Whereas you're just like pointing the finger all the time, as if like almost in elementary ages. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that with regards to the things you're talking about with the harsh suitable punishments, I think I've discussed that in the first place. What was your question again? I think it's time to move on. Yes, this gentleman here. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your fascinating encounter and engaging discussion. My question to Mr. Peter is that you keep bringing up stoning to death in Islam. I assume that you don't know the conditions of stoning to death in Islam. What is the burden of proof in Islam? You don't know. I assume.
Correct.
In the entire Islamic history, we don't have more than 20 cases. And 90%...
That's 20 cases.
Let me finish. We can respond.
90% of those cases are voluntary done submissions. Okay? People came forward themselves and they voluntarily submitted themselves to the Prophet. And most of these cases happened in the time of the Prophet. Now, amazingly, you are living in a society which has 167 rapes every day. A woman is being raped right now on this island as I speak to you. As I speak to you, a woman would be raped. So, would you rather have one stoning to death per millennium, or would you rather have 167 rapes every day? That's my first question. Would you like to answer that?
I'm very impressed by the example because normally humanists are accused of doing utilitarian calculations, whereas you seem to be wanting me to do one. I'm not particularly convinced by the stats. Also, I've been only using the stoning example just when I've been a little irritated by Hamza by implying that somehow out of the Quran you get clear moral guidance. You do not. You get a mishmash of moral guidance, witness the many disagreements. Yes, Hamza can keep on saying, I'm just making an ontological point, but at the end of the day, Hamza believes that the epistemology is there. He believes that in the Quran you get the answers. We know that many Quranic scholars give different versions of this, which lead to different sorts of laws in different societies. I think stoning of adulteresses, even if it's just 20 or 2, is morally wrong, full stop, especially when it's clearly contrived to be a very, very painful death, if we're following the example of Saudi Arabia. But I'm not saying, obviously I'm not saying 167 rapes are justified. I would be very eager to stress better education, better laws and so on in order to avoid those rapes. But I don't think one wrong is made right by trying to overcome another wrong.
This is where I have to take my gloves off if I haven't already. Basically, this is the problem with the liberal view. It's like almost a nightmare. You're arguing in a circle continuously. The reason I'm saying this is because, the liberal view is, things like rape have nothing to do with society or individuals, and saying that to a rapist, for example.
Rape has something to do with individuals.
Okay, it does. Okay, well,
it's bizarre to say it hasn't.
Well, thank you. You're arguing my point. Let me just argue it for you too.
What did you think I did think it has to do with?
Yeah, but let me make my point then. Well, maybe it's wine, as you say all the time. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this. Obviously, there's a phenomena. There's a social phenomena of 167 rapes. Say there's even 10 rapes a day, or 1 rape a day. It's still too many. Or even if it's to do with other things. If we look at even feminist literature, and we read the likes of feminist philosophers like Diane E. Russell, she developed an amazing academic paper on the causal model between pornography, as an example, which is allowed in liberal states, and rape. For example, there's some amazing statistics, like 35% of all college students, would rape if they could get away with it. 60% of rapists said, with the psychologists, that pornography was a causal factor in me raping because it dehumanized the woman. It made her into a piece of flesh, just a biology, just matter. So there are psychological, criminological and social evidences that accumulate together to show that there is something going wrong here. And the point is, if you do change those values and then say, if you jump the cohesive values and straight away, if you know you were to do that, you would get a harsh punishment, I think that's a great thing, because we're preventing lives being destroyed. You're saying it from a very one-dimensional perspective, a reductionist perspective. The individual is the only thing that really exists, yeah? I mean, this goes slap in the face of most social psychologists, criminologists, etc., that are asking even Western societies to change their type of outlook and behavior. For example, the Children's Society report, they had conclusions and they said, we need to start telling politicians, instead of talking about justice, rights, freedom, all these kind of words, start using words such as love, compassion, politicize these concepts so we really do love each other and have compassion, not only on the individualistic level but on the social and political level. And I think, in my opinion, even from a rational perspective, that the Quranic model or the Sharia, the Islamic law, is an amazing thing if you see it in its true light, which we hopefully just outlined and discussed. Now, you said to me that I do believe in epistemology, that the Quran does give you morality, but you said there's so many differences of opinion and conflicting answers from this morality. Well, I'm not going to agree with that, but say I did agree with that. Even in secular law, even in your outlook, there's problems. For example, the Dutch Constitution, Article 97, which can be found on the web, Part B, it says something like, we must impose this on minorities. Now, if you have a very vicious worldview, you can use that to do very bad things on minorities. So there's even legal difference of opinion and moral difference of opinion in your worldview. And I don't understand why you keep on throwing that at me. I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I just throw that back at you. Well, human beings are human beings and we are going to differ on certain things. But when it comes to the Quranic narrative, we have a concept called the ijma', which basically means the consensus amongst scholarship. And there are some fundamentals that have never been transgressed conceptually. And the other things that we believe God's mercy are differences of opinion that are valid and still binding. And I don't see that as a problem, especially when you have things like the Dutch Constitution, which was one of the first secular and liberal states, having problems with Article 97 Part B. So I think your argument is just another, boxer falling down and trying to give a jab,
Thank you, Hamza. So Peter, you do believe in prevention of that kind of crime, which is what Islam seeks to do by introducing these suitably harsh punishments with heavy burden of proof. So this is the Islamic viewpoint, and thank you very much for your answer. My second question, which is connected to the first question, is you kept raising this point that the religious societies or the religious hierarchy wishes to impose itself on those who are not religious. But that objection doesn't go against Islam, because if you read the Islamic history, as Hamza gave one of the examples from the Ottoman Empire, 16th century Ottoman Jerusalem, and he studied the records, the Jerusalem court records, and from 1536 to 1600, within these 17 years, we had 1,000 Jewish cases filed in the Islamic court. While they had their own best deal to go to, they chose the Islamic court. We have examples like that from Islamic Spain. We have examples like from the time of Sahaba, from early Caliphate of Islam. So this objection can go against the Catholic hierarchy or the Protestant hierarchy of the 16th, 17th century of England. But it doesn't work against Islam. Do you have something to say about this, please?
Yes. Oh, you want me to say more? I really don't know where to begin. But I shall begin, and I shall end quite swiftly. I think you are manifesting, are you not, that maybe, it might be very plausible, you have a very, very liberal reading of Islam. And that's fine. I strongly approve of that. I'd love to. And I have some Islamic friends, Muslim friends, who indeed are very liberal Muslims. But many, many other people today, as you must surely know, in many countries, have very conservative, rather stringent, rather harsh readings of Islam. it's fair enough for you to say, oh, well, they're not genuine Islamic states. But if one does wander around Iran, or if you do go around Saudi Arabia, you better not go unveiled if you're female. Nasty things will happen to you. That sort of Islamic state, I assume, then you disagree with. But I assume they claim to draw their morality, their understanding of the law from the Quran. I think they do claim that. But yes, there are many different versions, therefore. And that comes back to my point, to Hamza. Yes, secularists disagree about these things, but at least we don't hold up a book and say, the truth is in here, it's just a matter of interpreting it. We recognise we've got to learn to live with each other, we've got to show compassion, understanding, love. These are the things which would stress as much as Hamza stresses. And we muddle through. The mistake is to think that we're not muddling through, to think somehow there's a definitive answer to be found inside one particular text which happened to be written many years ago, maybe in some unique way, but it can't be that unique given it was written, I gather, in Arabic.
Thank you, Peter. I have, based upon your contention, I have a contention with your claim. In this country, if a woman walks the street topless, she is arrested. If a man does
that's a sad feature. That is a sad feature, I agree.
It is there in your liberal society.
Strangely, I do want to answer that, because although I actually I feel very uneasy, even in this audience, when I see many females completely covered, and I wonder how free have they actually chosen that to be. Nonetheless, I recognise there's a huge amount of conventions, customs, pressures within this society for, say, young girls to wear miniskirts or such, or wonder bras. And so I'm up for discussion about this. It's very difficult to know what the power of custom is and how far it should or shouldn't go. Hamza is always keen to stress the importance of community, so he seems to be quite keen on these sort of customs being forced on people. Following John Stuart Mill, I will talk about the tyranny of custom and trying to overcome it.
I think there will be plenty of opportunity to discuss with Muslims as to whether they are oppressed or not, so I think this is a great opportunity to do that. Just want to take another question from the audience. I think that gentleman in the beige jumper.
A question from the sister side, just because we've done two things.
Okay, we were taking some questions this way as well, so. Yeah, but I think we should do first come first. So we're egalitarian, so that brother had his hand up before.
My question is for Peter. He says that everyone has the right to life. Okay.
No, it's actually challenging whether there's much content to that claim.
Okay, so you said that everyone has the right to life. I just had an example when I just had a thought when you said that. Then talk about the murder. The person who was killed, he had the right to life, and his right was taken away. And when you have the criminal in front of you, that criminal also has the right to life. So what do? Do you give him the death penalty, or do you spare his life? This is a thing where humanism fails. I mean, if you have a religion, you can solve that through the whatever book which you say are useless. But if you do not follow a religion, then how do you decide this thing?
But how is that solved from the book when many, many religious believers actually argue about whether capital punishment should or should not exist, just as indeed many, many non-believers? My simple point here is actually the book doesn't actually help, because at the end of the day, many people argue about how to read the book.
At least it is a standard.
No, it's not. It's no standard at all. If some people come away and say, oh, so therefore we really should not permit capital punishment, and other people come away saying, oh, therefore we should.
So how do you decide?
Sorry?
How do you decide if how people say?
We negotiate, we muddle through, but we don't pretend the answer's in the book. And as you know, many of us would tend to think, well, overall, maybe compassion points towards not having the capital punishment. But I'm not suggesting there's easy answers here. My point is to say you also do not have easy answers by suddenly announcing, as Hamza keeps announcing, oh, God is the standard. It doesn't help at all, because you have similar sorts of arguments. At the end of the day, you need to rely on your humanity, feeling of compassion, maybe the effects on society, maybe the effects with regard to deterrence, and so on.
I mean, just to put a different slant to this question, from a humanist, secularist, atheist, non-religious perspective, they would never argue that the mind should never be the source of law. They would never argue against that our minds and the result of our thinking should never be the source of law, without any justification. What I'm arguing here, that God should be the source of law. If you can't justify your source, why do you expect me to justify mine? But what I've done today is actually justify my source. And I think it's quite saddening to see that you keep on pointing the finger at me and saying, just this book, when I have actually given you a whole argument for why I believe this book. You have greater reasons to believe that it comes from a transcendental cognitive power. And you didn't deal with these arguments. So I have a basis for my source of law. The basis for your source of law, and again, which goes back to morality, is again based upon subjective concepts such as evolution, social pressure, etc. So when I say God is the standard, God is the standard because He, again, and I repeat, is the concept, the transcendental concept that goes beyond human subjectivity. You do have a standard, but your standard is subjective, and that's what I'm saying. Because it's evolution, it changes, social pressure, it changes, therefore it's subjective. Do you understand that point?
I have a horrible feeling we're going to be boring the audience as we keep going round and round the same loop. Just to repeat my bit, and then you'll repeat your bit, and I'll repeat my bit, and then eventually we're turned into pumpkins, or Cinderella will come along.
That's a very subjective viewpoint.
Nothing is actually helped by keeping on announcing God is the standard. Because you don't know anything about God unless you start saying it's all inside the Quran. And then we come to your argument saying, oh well, the Quran is so specially written or structured or something novel in Arabic such that it must have been caused by some transcendent being. I don't accept that at all. For a start, I very much doubt if it really is some specially structured work. But even if it is, that's the way the world has come about.
That wasn't my argument. You're just building another argument here.
Well, Keith, which feature of the Quran? You said something about it used the Arabic language in a way which no one else has used.
If you don't know, why don't you ask me the question?
Because you keep referring to this, and it's baffling what you mean.
Well, ask me. Hamza, what did you mean?
It clearly was written in the Arabic language. I assume,
yep.
I think it's good. So clearly it's not something which could not be expressed in the Arabic language. And so presumably some human beings wrote it down, and so that's manifested the fact that some natural human beings managed to express it in the Arabic language. There's no further need to say, oh, there's some transcendent power behind it. It doesn't help.
But that's not the argument. Do you want to give the argument again?
Not really, but feel free to.
I mean, in fairness, sorry, can I take that?
Fairness?
Can you see it on YouTube afterwards? I don't know.
I mean, in fairness, if I didn't understand a particular argument of yours, I would have said, Peter, what do you mean by that? I want to inquire about the truth of your claims. So some of the claims you're testing. What you've done to mine is you've misconstrued them. I'm not saying deliberately, but you have misconstrued them. And I've said that you have, then you're saying, well, my assumption and my assumption. But it's just assumption. The best thing to do is say, Hamza, what is it about the Quran that makes it a miracle?
Let me say then, Hamza, give me one sentence at a time so I can check, I can understand each sentence. Without too many ands or buts in.
Okay, that's interesting. Because and is a conjunctive particle that links concepts together. If I don't use an and, then I won't have a conversation.
Well, it could be an eternally long question, couldn't it? And this.
Do we have time?
No, definitely not.
We don't have time, but... We don't have time.
Well, on that profound note, I'm sorry I couldn't take all the questions. The speakers will be here, so you can come up to them individually afterwards and speak to them about your particular questions. We are running short of time, and I think it's good that we got to at least a good point when it came to the discussions available. I'd like to thank today's participants, Peter Cave and Hamza Tzortzis, and I hope there'll be another debate coming to you soon. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamualaikum Salim. Quite an interesting and heated debate tonight. What did you think?
Well, I mean, my remit as the chair was really for the discussions to go to a logical conclusion. This is philosophy. We're not talking about a political debate where it's just sound bites and people get to ask lots of questions. I mean, some people perhaps didn't like the way I did that, but I felt that it was very necessary to get to the philosophical conclusion at the end of all the discussions. So that's why I let the to and froing happen discussion between Hamza and Peter.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't that much in regards to vocal questions to and fro from the audience, as you just previously said. So did you think, in regards to the audience, that they've taken any benefit or that they've understood what both of the speakers were trying to say?
I think to a certain extent, yes, but I must say, and I'll be very truthful here, that some of the questions that I got, which were actually written in by the Muslims because they were aimed at Peter Cave and they were criticizing him, were again reiterating some simple truths that were discussed in the debate, but were not adding real value, which is why I had to ignore a lot of them. You know, it was asked already to death in many respects, but there's two angles to this. One is that Muslims need to see that there is an intellectual discussion. So whether all of them understand that or not is not necessarily the case. However, if some people understood it and are able to carry then that's the job done. You know, it's not for everybody to understand the discussion, but at least everyone can appreciate there is a discussion, and for those who are able to, they can carry on with the debate if they understood it.
Quite a few non-Muslims were there present. Did you have any feedback from them, or did you know what they thought about the talk?
Well, it was interesting because there was a humanist who I spoke to afterwards, and again he came from a different tack to Peter, and his we had an interesting discussion afterwards where he said, well, what is truth? And they went into discussion as well, it doesn't really matter what is truth as long as I know that the coat you're wearing is black, and if I say Palam as his name is, if you pass me that black coat, then you know what I'm talking about and I know what I'm talking about. That's all that matters. So then he got a little bit stumped on that, but as long as we get people to realise that, look, there is a truth, and that truth is with Islam, and that's what we need to do as Muslims. That's our responsibility.
Hello Peter, and thank you for the debate today. How did you feel it went?
Well, I feel I offended some women apparently for speaking for all Muslim women. Well, I'm sure when you hear the tape, I just said maybe some women have been oppressed in wearing the veil. But overall, I feel I burble away, and I should have made a few more jokes, but at the end of the day, the very serious point I'm making, is things are pretty bad if you have to rely on some ancient text for how you ought to live. You ought to rely on your humanity, your fellow feeling, your concern for reason and fairness, and it depresses me a lot that so many people in the audience seem to say, oh, well, it says so in the Quran that we should do this or that, and that worries me. To say that morality is grounded in God, that doesn't help if at the end of the day God is incomprehensible.
There was a bit of a bout in regards to verbal words. Did you feel that any of your beliefs were challenged at all?
Verbal words as opposed to non-verbal words? My beliefs are always challenged, I think, because as a humanist and an atheist and a rationalist, I like debate, I like argument and discussion. That's, once again, is why I feel it's very, very sad that somehow some people say, oh no, you must always come back to the Quran or the Bible or maybe some other text. They're just texts, they have some interesting comments in, no doubt, but they're written by men, normally men rather than women, because I think Islam still tends to think man is superior to woman in some respects, but at the end of the day I'm happy to debate and I enjoy it.
Any benefits that you take in regards to today's debate?
The benefits is feeling very, very tired, and although Hamza has made quips about my Alcoholics Anonymous need, I do feel like a drink, which I gather isn't very, very opportune for many Islamic believers except when they're not being watched.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Hamza. How did you feel about the event today?
I think it was a positive event. I think it's one of the first times, I think, in the country that we debated the topic of religion and Islam, not from a philosophical point of view in terms of can you prove God exists, although there was some of that today, or can you prove the miracle of the Quran, which was some of that today too, but the focus was life, how it affects us, can we live better lives without religion. So it's very difficult, and the way I tried to argue was general and specific, giving some academic sociological evidence, showing the logic of submission by proving the existence of God and the miracle of the Quran, also showing about morality, that you need a religious perspective of morality for it to be objective. If you don't have a religious perspective, it's subjective, and also about a political argument of like Islamic economics deals with the biggest problems of economy, such as poverty and distribution of wealth. So in that case, we gave some positive arguments. I personally believe that Peter gave although he was rhetorical just like I was, we've got very similar characters, but I don't think he gave some substance to the counter arguments, and I think that was the big problem today.
It's kind of a battle of bouts there in regards to little witty remarks. I mean, do you think that your points were, clear enough, and do you think that people reciprocated them well?
Well, I think the point of a debate is not actually to lecture and make people actually learn your arguments. It's to point out that there are certain concepts in Islam or religion that are quite interesting. There was some argument that I understood, and maybe let me go further and research more. And the whole point of having debates in this post-liberal, post-secular society, post-modern society, is to show that Islam has a positive case for society, past, present, and future. And I think that's what we should be doing. And I think the objective of the debate is to motivate the Muslims and to show to the non-Muslims that there is an alternative narrative on religious discourse.
Now, in regards to the people and their questions, it seemed that even the Muslims, the way they wanted to get at Peter Cave with regards to his comments, how did you think he was in regards to his rebuttals to yours?
Personally, I know Peter Cave well because I've read his books, and I feel quite close to him, to be honest. I've seen some things on him on YouTube. He's a very nice and more polite kind of individual. Obviously, it's a heated debate. Obviously, we did mistakes in terms of some of our attitudes. But I think the main concept is that I don't think Peter was ready for the arguments. I think he didn't look into the arguments that well. He didn't probably want to see my arguments that well, because I don't blame him, because in this society we have a presumption of humanism, we have a presumption of atheism, we have a presumption of liberalism, so everything is viewed from that perspective, and I think that's the problem. So I think today we try to undercut that perspective, and that's why I think he was slightly shaken.
Any wise words for non-Muslims that may have watched this and thought, it was interesting? What would you give your 2 cents on what today?
Sure, well, I don't want to speak for non-Muslims, but a non-Muslim did come up to me and she thought it was an amazing debate. She thought there was quite valid points from religious and non-religious perspectives, and she also thought that there is something particularly special about Islam, and maybe we should read about and have a sincere look on it, and not have the outdated cliches and the caricatures of Sharia law, but to find out what is Islam all about.
Any wise words, or departing words, let's say, for Muslims and non-Muslims alike?
Well, I think the Quran talks about different realities, and it says ponder on all these realities and come to a conclusion. If we do that, I think we should be fine.
Jazakallah khairan, Hamza.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.